So, most everyone here in this room has their thing. And when I say you have your thing, what I mean is there's this thing that you do that's kind of like a guilty pleasure, that maybe started out as a guilty pleasure. Like, it may or may not be a sinful thing, but it's probably not the best for you, not the best for you if you do it a lot. And but it's attractive. We get into these things. I'll give you some examples in just a little bit, but it's a thing that you do that it brings you comfort, it brings distraction, it alleviates whatever kind of suffering for the moment, and but then you feel bad about it later. But you keep going at it, going back to it. Maybe you've tried to stop it or tried to limit it, but you keep going back. And at a certain point, you realize that you don't have this thing, that this thing has you. Now, not everybody here, okay? So there's been a lot of research done about addictive behavior or compulsive behavior. And what we now know is that in the general population, it breaks down in thirds. There's a third of you lucky people who are just not really susceptible to compulsive or addictive behavior. And I'm just going to invite you during this message today to not be judgmental and not be smug, all right? So some of you don't really struggle with this, and that's great. You can be thankful for that, but hopefully this will help you understand where other people are at. Then there's about a third of the population is what we would call moderately susceptible. Depending on the conditions in their life and how things unfold, they could get sucked into addiction or maybe not. And then there's other people, there's about a third of the population who are very susceptible. And maybe will tend to have multiple addictions. And if they find themselves in recovery from one addiction, they might go to another addiction. And there's a mixture, there's a variety of things going on. It has to do, to some degree, it has to do with our genetics. There have actually been studies done of twins, identical twins, who were raised in different environments, and they found a connection between addiction rates, even amongst these twins who grew up in different environments with different things around them. So some of it is like heritable. Some of it, and part of that genetics is that there's actually something going on in our brains that causes us to get less pleasure from things, and then to like be continually looking for and needing more dopamine hits than the average population. So that's part of what's going on there. The other thing that's going on, the other factor, has to do with trauma, especially early in life. A lot of suffering, and people will, as they're growing up, let's say kids, as they're growing up, will find certain things that relieve them of that suffering, and they get sucked into addiction really quick. Now, so here's this chart, but what I want to say is that I have a belief. You can agree or disagree with this. I have a belief that we're going to see this even expanding, and that more and more people are going to be susceptible, even if they're not already, because we're living in a time where, Paul Graham calls it the acceleration of addictiveness. And he wrote about this in 2010. This is an article he wrote. He's actually a tech guy. And he's in Silicon Valley, and he was seeing what was going on with social media, seeing what was going on with how, we'll get into this, but even the drugs are getting more powerful. And what he's saying is that there's technological changes that make everything better. And that's great. We have cars that are more powerful, that get better gas mileage. We have all these different things that improve our lives in all kinds of ways. And with that technological progress also comes a progress in how people are able to refine the chemicals, and so that all these things that even in the past people might have become addicted to are much more addictive today because they're refined and they're much more addictive than they used to be. So here's what he said. He says, what hard liquor, cigarettes, heroin, crack, and now things like ultra-processed junk food, internet pornography, what all these things have in common is that they are all more concentrated forms of less addictive predecessors. So the alcohol that we drink is more potent than the alcohol back in the day. Cocaine, people in native cultures take this plant and they chew on it when they have long journeys to take, and this plant, chewing on this plant gives them a boost of energy. Well, it's that plant that is refined to make cocaine. That's an example of how we have these technologies that make everything more addictive. Most, if not all, of the things that we describe as addictive they are more potent things than what they used to be. And the scary thing is, the process that created them is accelerating. So he says, we struggle to find a word for this. What is a good word for this? Probably the best word is addictive, although that's maybe not even the best because it has different associations. It means different things to different people. But call it addictiveness or compulsion. It's things that bring flood of dopamine into our system. And some other neurochemicals as well, just the feel-good chemicals. And, drugs of abuse, obviously, alcohol, cigarettes, gambling, especially online gambling has become way more addictive than gambling used to be. Ultra-processed junk food, there are engineers who specifically design food to touch on or trip what they call the bliss point of the combination of sugar, salt, and fat, and the certain taste in your mouth to make you want more. And even though you eat more, you don't feel more full. So is that technology. Pornography or erotic content sort of allows a 10-year-old kid in one night to have as much sexual experience or sexual provocation as the average person had in their entire lifetime in previous generations. So it's like this super powerful thing. Video gaming, again, same thing. These games are designed to capture your attention, get you going more and more. The use of our smartphones, I forget what the percentage is. There's a very high percentage of people that admit that they are addicted to their smartphone. What do we check it? 200, almost 300 times a day. It's between 200 and 300 times a day the average American looks at their phone. Social media use. So all these things. Now here's the thing. Are these sinful? Are they? So some of them, just doing them at all is an experience of sin. Like looking at pornography, I think that would be an example. That's a sinful behavior because you're violating God's commandment about lust. But you see, a lot of these things, they're not necessarily evil or bad in and of themselves. Let's take alcohol as an example. Is alcohol sinful? People in the Bible times drank alcohol. Jesus turned water into wine. But the issue is that there's a line that gets crossed with a lot of these things, that you take this thing that is maybe okay or maybe not so bad, but when it begins to take over your life, it becomes a problem, right? So it's really important that everyone understands this point. Addiction is not either or. Compulsion is not a matter of either you're compulsive about it or you're not. You know, either it's bad, you're completely out of control addict, or you're fine. We are on a spectrum with this, where on the one hand it might be just a very innocent, guilty pleasure that we do once in a while, and if we decide to stop, we can stop. If we decide to limit it, we can limit it, right? And then it gets harder and harder until we reach the point. Serious addiction is where the phrase comes in, impaired function, that it basically makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to live your life. Okay? So people are on a spectrum with these things. And it's also true that if you go back and look at this list of the various things, they are kind of on a spectrum of how destructive they are, right? So, it's one thing to be addicted, to be compulsive about the use of video games, and how that might impair your life, how that might wreck your life. Compare that to being addicted to meth, and how that will affect your life, right? So some of these things are like more clearly, more obviously, and in a more rapid fashion will destroy your life. But you know what? They all will wreck your life to some degree. And again, many of us were dealing with these things that at some point we started to do them, and they made our lives better. They relieved us in some way. But now we're hooked, and they're making our lives worse. So Jesus came preaching and demonstrating. He came bringing the kingdom of heaven. We don't hear that language a lot in the Gospel of John, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's almost like all he talked about. Everything was about the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven was this thing that God is doing in the world, where he's bringing all the things in the world into alignment with the way that God intended things to be. And so that bringing into alignment is, first of all, bringing people into reconciliation with God. And so in the evangelical church, we're very comfortable. We like laser focus on this aspect of the kingdom, which is the forgiveness of sins, and that allows people then to have this restored relationship with God, and then promises about eternity. But keep in mind, that's part of what Jesus was bringing. And the disciples, the apostles then brought, because they also brought transformation and therefore healing in people's lives now, today. In other words, it didn't just come into their lives and then give them a hope for the future, a hope for their afterlife. It actually brought change and relief and transformation and healing right now. All right, so that then brings us to this story. This account of Jesus, it's one of many, 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 many stories of Jesus bringing healing to someone. And he goes into this pool, and Charlene and I had a chance to go to Israel some years ago, and had a chance to go to this place. It was kind of surreal to be there at the place that they believe is this pool. And it's actually not that far from the temple. People would go to this place, and it was like a natural spring, and it would bubble up. And they believed that it was that the Holy Spirit, that God was stirring up the waters, and so then if whoever got in first would get healed. And I mean, can you imagine a more comic, tragic scene? That the water is stirred, and now there's a race of all these people who can't, who have bodily problems trying to get into the water first. It's crazy to think about this, but that's what they did. That's how they lived. And again, it almost boggles the mind to imagine that this guy had been hanging out in this place for almost 40 years. 38 years. He'd been going to this place and never getting into the water and never getting healed. So Jesus meets this guy, and he asks him a question. Now, if you were to meet a guy in this situation, what would you ask him? What kind of question would you ask? Like, how do you the therapist question? How do you feel about this? Or what's going on? Or how can I help you get into the water? Maybe I could get some of the other people out of the way and get you in first. Jesus asks this very insulting question, really, and it turns out to be what I consider to be the $1 million question. It's a $1 million question for this guy. It's a $1 million question for any of us who are here struggling with any kind of compulsive behavior. And that question is, do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Now again, it seems insulting because this guy's been there for 38 years. Well, duh, Jesus, of course he wants to get well. Why would he be there? But do you notice how he answers? He doesn't say an immediate yes. Look at that, at the verse. He's like, well, I've been coming here and people get in front of me and which is true, which is fair, but at some point, I don't know. It's a question worth asking, and it's at some point there's almost an acceptance and a willingness to deal with whatever life puts, whatever we're experiencing, rather than really wanting what God has for us. Now, this is the problem, that when it comes to finding healing from these, let's just say, behavioral issues that we're struggling with the sins that we get entangled in, with compulsions, with addictions, is that we sort of want to get well. Part of us wants to get well, but the other part of us is kind of okay with, we want to get well, sort of. We want to get well, but we want to be able to do this a little bit. We want to get well, but we don't want to have to do a lot of work to get there. When I was working with Mark Laser doing recovery workshops, I did this work for 5 years. We ran workshops that people from around the country would go to, and it was around people with sexual struggles of various kinds. And I'll never forget a conversation I had with this guy. He was a pastor of a pretty large church, and he was struggling with, actually I think he was a youth pastor, and he was struggling with looking at pornography, and it was a serious issue. And he was saying to me, I want to be free from this. I will do whatever. And he was very earnest, and very, just went on and on. Let's just say, went on and on about how serious he was, how he would do anything to get rid of this behavior. So then I started talking about the things that we offered. And we have these workshops, and then we have small groups, and then there's these things that you do. And he's like, oh, I didn't realize it was going to be that expensive. I didn't realize I'd be going to these things all the time. I'll get back to you, right? Sort of want to get well as long as it doesn't cost me. This is what I call magical thinking. And Christians, we are invited, we are called on, we are challenged to demonstrate faith, to believe that God brings healing, right? We believe that. And but I want to say there's a difference between real faith and what I would call magical thinking. Real faith is when we trust that God has the ability to heal us, and that we will cooperate and do what he calls us to do. Magical thinking, on the other hand, is where we want God to just fix our problem instantly without us having to do much, right? So I want healing of this problem in my life, but I don't want to have to get honest with people. I don't want to have to be vulnerable. I don't want to have to take a lot of time to do the work that I need to do to find this healing. See, we want magic, and sometimes God gives us a method. We want to be passive recipients of something that God just magically does for us, but instead, God calls us to a different level of obedience. I'll give you an example. We'll talk about this before we get to the Old Testament example. Think about how Jesus healed people. Do you realize that we have all kinds of stories of Jesus healing people, and he used kind of different methods. He had them do different things depending on their situation. Here's some examples. So this man with a withered hand in Mark chapter 3, it's also recorded in a couple of the other Gospels, he tells him, stretch out your hand. He didn't heal him on the spot. He asked him to stretch out his hand, which would have required trust and a kind of vulnerability because it was a weird hand. The 10 lepers, he tells them to go and show themselves to the priest, which would have been very, very difficult for them to do because they were not supposed to be in public. If they would go to the priest would have to run away because they were unclean. But he's saying, you do this, go to the priest, go show yourselves to the priest. And the healing happened as they went. So they were called to take this step of obedience, and in the taking of the step of obedience, they were healed. There was another healing of a man born blind at a different pool, the pool of Siloam. And that time, Jesus made mud with saliva, placed it on his eyes, and then told him to go wash. And it was in the process of the washing that he was restored. And here, with this paralytic at the pool, Jesus says, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. Notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, get into the water. He doesn't say, let's wait until this water is stirred up again and I'll help you get in. He says, no, get up, take up your mat, and walk. So he's challenging him to act, even though he'd been unable to act in this way for 38 years. So instead of simply just magically fixing things, this is my observation about how life works, particularly when it comes to the challenges that people are living in that relate to their behavior. God calls us to take action. God calls us to take certain steps of faith, and then in the taking of those steps, we find healing. Here's my favorite example of this is the story of Naaman in 2 Kings 5. And so this guy is a powerful general, and he has leprosy. And so he goes to the prophet, and he wants the prophet to heal him, which is cool. Travels a long distance with his, military gang. But the prophet doesn't even bring him into his house. In fact, the prophet doesn't even see him. The prophet sends out a servant to him, and the servant tells him to go wash yourself in the Jordan River, and when you do that, then you're going to get healed. And this guy is offended. He's like, the guy doesn't even see me. He doesn't come do the administrating of the healing. He doesn't do his thing. He just sends this other guy, and he wants me to get baptized in this really crummy. It's a muddy, murky river. He's like, why would I do that? There's a better river back where we're coming from. And it's his servant who talks him into it. He says, just try it, Master. Please, just do it. We've come all this way. Just do it. And he does it, and then he is healed. There's something about what he had to do that brought about some transformation in him that needed to happen. That was part of the healing. It wasn't just that those spots got removed. There was something that needed to be changed in Naaman. And that happened through this method. So you might have heard this. There's a saying that God helps those who help themselves, right? And then the Christian version of that is to say, no, God will do things for us that we can't do for ourselves, right? And that's what grace is. That God reaches into our lives and God does things for us that we can't do for ourselves. I think it was Charles Spurgeon who was talking about this quote, and he extended it. He has a second phrase. So it goes like this: God will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, but God will not do for us what we can do for ourselves. I have 2 sons. They're grown now, and they're able to tie their shoes fine. When they were little, Charlene and I would tie their shoes for them. What would you say if I told you that, when they were in high school, every morning Charlene and I would still tie their shoes for them before they went off to school? You would say I was a very weird parent, or maybe they were disabled kids or something, right? A good parent would not do those things for a growing child, because you want that child to grow up. If you always do those things, it's in the doing of those things that they learn and grow. That's how life works. That's how the Christian life works. And we constantly want magic. We just want God to do it. We just want God to fix it. We just want God to take care of it. So God, I have this problem in my life. I'm going to pray to you. Here's the deal I'm going to make. I'll make a deal with you, God. I will pray to you. I will trust in you. And I'm just going to trust that you will fix it. And so the hope is that, 6 months from now, a year from now, I will be the same person with the same friends, with the same habits, the same ways of thinking, living with the same media input. Everything about my life is the same except for this particular symptom is gone. Doesn't work that way. God loves us too much to leave us in that place. So God brings healing to us as we take these steps of faith. So, what is the area that comes to your mind when we're talking here about the guilty pleasure that's become a struggle? This thing that you have that ultimately you realize has you. What is that in your life? And whatever it is, that's the question. This is the question for us. Do you want to get well? And there's a way that God wants to bring healing into each one of our lives. And that way of bringing healing into our lives is again, it's not a magical infusion, it's a transformation that God wants to bring in our lives. So that at the end of the experience, it's not simply that I'm the same sinful, self-absorbed, kind of not very developed Christian who now, with this certain habit, and then down the line, I'm the same self-absorbed, not very developed Christian without that habit. No, God is going to work in my life to bring about transformation, and it's in the getting of the healing that my life is transformed. So, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to say to God, whatever you're calling me to do, I'll do it. I'll follow your path. So there's this, there's a saying in recovery language, and maybe you've heard about this, that people will talk about how they hit bottom. And so if you go like to 12-step meetings, you'll hear people, that will talk about these terrible things that have happened in their lives, how they've lost jobs because of their addiction. They've gotten big illnesses, or they've lost relationships, and it's after all these losses, the pain in their life was so great that they're willing to say, okay, I really want to get well, so I will do whatever it takes, right? And you see this when you start working with people with addiction, that some people, they sort of want to get well, but they just haven't experienced enough. They haven't. There's something that's they're not really going to be willing to do what they need to do. They're not going to be willing to take the steps of obedience that they need to take. So they haven't hit bottom. But here's the thing. What does hitting bottom mean? What does it really mean? Have you hit bottom? Let me ask you this. When does a person hit bottom? Whenever they decide they've hit bottom. There is no bottom. It's just, it can keep, however bad your life is, it will keep getting worse. So there are people who hit bottom when they had a certain amount of consequences. They're like, okay, I'm going to change. But then there are people who just kept on, and then they lost jobs. They didn't hit bottom there. They lost relationships. They lost everything. They went to jail. So whatever is happening in your life, it can get worse, and it will get worse if we don't take the steps that God's calling us to do. That's the bad news, but the good news is you don't have to wait for some mythical, magical hitting bottom. Bottom can be right now, today. When you reach the point of saying, I want to get well. I don't want to be laying around this pool for 38 more years, waiting for, I'm going to take Jesus' commands. I'm going to take his calling and take the steps that he calls me to take. I really want to get well.